Hi, welcome to the 11th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, page number 29, Fingerprint Classics. I'm going to walk to the fountain and back, she said, for she could stand it no longer. Dr. Holmes might say there was nothing the matter. Far rather would she that he were dead. She could not sit beside him when he stared so and did not see her and made everything terrible. Sky and tree, children playing, dragging carts, blowing whistles, falling down, all were terrible. And he could not kill himself, and she could tell no one. Septimus has been working too hard. That was all she could say to her own mother. To love makes one solitary, she thought. She could tell nobody, not even Septimus now, and looking back, she saw him sitting in his shabby overcoat alone on the seat, hunched up, staring. And it was crowded, and it was cowardly for a man to say. He could kill himself, but Septimus had fought. He was brave. He was not Septimus now. She put on her lace collar, she put on her new hat, and he never noticed. And he was happy without her. Nothing could make her happy without him, nothing. He was selfish, so men are. For he was not ill. Dr. Holmes said there was nothing the matter with him. She spread her hand before her. Look, her wedding ring slipped. She had grown so thin. It was she who suffered, but she had nobody to tell. Far was the tally and the white houses in the room where her sisters sat making hats, and the streets crowded every evening with people walking, laughing out loud, not half alive like people here, huddled up in bath chairs, looking at a few ugly flowers stuck in pots. For you should see the Milan gardens, she said aloud, but to whom? There was nobody. Her words faded. So a rocket fades. Its sparks, having grazed their way into the night, surrender to it. Dark descent pours over the outlines of houses and towers. Bleak hillsides soften and fall in. But though there was But though they are gone, the night is full of them, robbed of color, blank of windows. They exist more ponderously, give out what the frank daylight fails to transmit. The trouble and suspense of things conglomerated there in the darkness, huddled together in the darkness, reft of the relief which dawn brings when, washing the walls white and grey, spotting each window pane, lifting the mist from the fields, showing the red showing the red brown cows peacefully grazing. All is once more decked out to the eye, exist again. I'm alone, she cried by the fountain in Regent's Park, staring at the Indian and his cross, as perhaps at midnight, when all boundaries are lost, the country reverts to its ancient shape, as the Romans saw it, lying cloudly, when they landed, and the hills had no names, and rivers would they knew not where. Such was her darkness, when suddenly, as if a shelf was shot forth, and she stood on it, she said how she was his wife, married years ago in Milan, his wife, would never tell that he was mad. Turning the shelf fell, down she dropped. For he was gone, she thought, gone as he threatened to kill himself, to throw himself under a cart. But no, there he was, still sitting alone on the seat, in his shabby overcoat, his legs crossed, staring, talking aloud. Men must not cut down trees. There is a God. He noted such revelations on the backs of envelopes. Change the world. No one kills from hatred. Make it known. He wrote it down. He waited. He listened. A sparrow perched on the railing opposite chirped Septimus. Septimus 4 or 5 minutes over and went on, drawing its notes out, to sing freshly and piercingly in Greek words, how there is no crime, and joined by another sparrow. They sang in voices prolonged and piercing in Greek words, from trees in the meadow of life beyond a river where the dead walk, how there is no dead. There was his hand, there the dead. White things were assembling behind the railings opposite, but he dared not look. Evans was behind the railings. What are you saying? Said Razia suddenly, sitting down by him, interrupted again. She was always interrupting. Away from people, they must get away from people, he said, jumping up, right away over there, where there were chairs beneath a tree and the long rope and long slope of the park, dipped like a length of green stuff, with a ceiling cloth of blue and pink, smoke high above. And there was a rampart of far irregular houses cased in smoke. The traffic hummed in a circle, and on the right, dun colored animals stretched long necks over the zoo palings, barking, howling. They sat down under a tree. Hi, welcome listeners to the 12th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, page number 32, Fingerprint Classics. Look, she implored him, pointing at a little troop of boys carrying cricket stumps, and one shuffled, spun round on his heel and shuffled, as if he were acting a clown at the music hall. Look, she implored him. Dr. Holmes had told her to make him notice real things. Go to a music hall, play cricket. That was the very game. Dr. Holmes said, a nice out of door game, the very game for her husband. Look, she repeated. Look, the unseen bade him, the voice which now communicated with him, who was the greatest of mankind, Septimus, lately taken from life to death, the Lord who had come to renew society, who lay like a coverlet, a snow blanket, smitten only by the sun, for ever unwasted, suffering for ever, the scapegoat, the eternal sufferer, but he did not want it. He moaned, putting from him with a wave of his hand that eternal suffering, that eternal loneliness. Look, she repeated, for he must not talk aloud to himself out of doors. Oh, look, she implored him. But what was there to look at? A few sheep, that was all. The way to Regent's Park tube station. Could they tell her the way to Regent's Park tube station? Macy Johnson wanted to know. She was only up from Edinburgh 2 days ago. Not this way, over there, Razia exclaimed, waving her aside, lest she should see Septimus. Both seemed queer, Macy Johnson thought. Everything seemed very queer. In London for the first time, come to take up a post at her uncle's in Leadenhall Street, and now walking through Regent's Park in the morning, this couple on the chairs gave her quite a turn. The young woman seemed foreign, the man looking queer, so that should she be very old, she would still remember and make it jangle again among her memories. How she had walked through Regent's Park on a fine summer's morning 50 years ago, for she was only 19 and had got her way at last to come to London. And now, how queer it was, this couple she had asked the way of. The girl started and jerked her hand. And the man, he seemed awfully odd, quarrelling, perhaps parting for ever. Perhaps something was up, she knew. And now all these people, for she returned to the broad walk, the stone basins, the prim flowers, the old men and women, invalids, most of them in bad chairs, all seemed after Edinburgh so queer. And Macy Johnson, as she joined the gently trudging, vaguely gazing, breeze kissed company, squirrels perching and preening, sparrow fountains fluttering for crumbs, dogs busy with the railings, busy with each other, while the soft warm air washed over them and lent to the fixed, unsurprised gaze with which they received life something whimsical and mollified. Macy Johnson positively felt she must cry. Oh, for the young man on the seat had given her quite a turn. Something was up, she knew. Horror, horror. She wanted to cry. She had left for people. They had warned her what would happen. Why hadn't she stayed at home? She cried, twisting the knob of the iron railing. That girl, thought Mrs. Dempster, who saved crusts for the squirrels and often ate her lunch in Regent's Park. Don't know a thing yet, and really it seemed to her better to be a little stout, a little slack, a little moderate in one's expectations. Percy drank. Well, better to have a son, thought Mrs. Dempster. She had had a hard time of it, and couldn't help smiling at a girl like that. You will get married, for you're pretty enough, thought Mrs. Dempster. Get married, she thought, and then you will know. Oh, the cooks and so on. Every man has his ways, but whether I'd have chosen quite like that if I could have known, thought Mrs. Dempster, and could not help wishing to be whisper a word to Maisie Johnson, to feel on the creased pouch of her worn old face the kiss of pity, for it's been a hard life, thought Mrs. Dempster. What hadn't she given to it? Roses, figure, her feet too. She thought the knobbed lumps beneath her skirt. Roses, she thought, sardonically, all trash, ma'am dear, for really, what with eating, drinking, and matting, the bad days and good, life had been no mere matter of roses, and what was more, let me tell you, Carrie Dempster had no wish to change her lot with any woman's in Kentish town, but she implored pity, pity for the loss of roses, pity she asked of Macy Johnson standing by the hyacinth beds. But the aeroplanes hadn't. Mrs. Dempster always longed to see foreign parts. She had a nephew, missionary, it sewed and shot. She always went to the sea to market, not out of sight of land, but she had no patience with women who were afraid of water. It swept and fell. Her stomach was in her mouth. Up again. There's a fine young feller abroad of it, Mrs. Dempster waggled, and away it went, fast and fading, away and away. The aeroplane shot, soaring over Greenwich and all the masts, over the little island of grey churches, St. Paul's and the rest till, on either side of London, fields spread out and dark brown woods, where adventurous thrushes, hopping boldly, glancing quickly, snatched a snail and tapped it, tapped him on a stone once, twice, thrice. Away and away the aeroplane shot, till it was nothing but a bright spark, an aspiration, a concentration, a symbol. So it seemed to Mr. Bentley, vigorously rolling his strip of turf at Greenwich, of a man's soul, of his determination, thought Mr. Bentley, sweeping round the cedar tree to get outside this body, beyond his house, by means of thought, Einstein, speculation, mathematics, the Mendelian theory, away the aeroplane shot. Then, while a seedy looking note script man carrying a leather bag stood on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral and hesitated, for within was what balm, how great a welcome, how many tombs with banners waving over them, tokens of victories, nor over armies, but over, he thought, that plague spirit of truth seeking, which leaves me at present without a situation, and more than that, the cathedral offers company, he thought, invites you to membership of a society, great men belong to it, martyrs have died for it. Why not enter it, he thought, put his leather bag stuffed with pamphlets before an altar, a cross, the symbol of something which has soared beyond seeking and questioning and knocking of words together, has become all spirit, disembodied, ghostly. Why not enter in? He thought, and while he hesitated, out flew the aeroplane over Ludgate Circus. It was strange, it was still. Not a sound was to be heard above the traffic. Unguided it seemed, sped off its own free will, and now curving up and up, straight up, like something mounting in ecstasy, in pure delight. Out from behind poured white smoke looping, writing a T, an O, an F. Hi, welcome listeners to the 13th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, page number 35, Fingerprint Classics. What are they looking at? Said Clarissa Dalloway to the maid who opened the door. The hall of the house was cool as a vault. Mrs. Dalloway raised her hand to her eyes, and as the maid shut the door too, and she heard the swish of Lucy's skirts, she felt like a nun who has left the world and feels fold round her the familiar wheels and the response to old devotions. The cook whistled in the kitchen. She heard the click of the typewriter. It was her life, and bending her head over the hall table, she bowed beneath the influence, felt blessed and purified, saying to herself as she took the pad with the telephone message on it, how moments like this are buds on the tree of life. Flowers of darkness, they are, she thought, as if some lovely rose had blossomed for her eyes only. Not for a moment did she believe in God, but all the more she thought, taking up the pad, must one repay in daily life to servants, yes, to dogs and canaries, above all to Richard, her husband, who was the foundation of it, of the gay sounds, of the green lights, of the cook even whistling, for Mr. Walker was Irish and whistled all day long. One must pay back from this secret deposit of exquisite moment, she thought, lifting the pad while Lucy stood by her, trying to explain how Mr. Dalloway, ma'am. Clarissa read on the telephone pad, Lady Bruton wishes to know if Mr. Dalloway will lunch with her today. Mr. Dalloway, ma'am, told me to tell you he would be lunching out. Dear, said Clarissa, and Lucy shared as, as she meant her to her disappointment, but not the pang, felt the concord between them. Took the hint, thought how the gentry love gild her own future with calm, and taking Mrs. Dalloway's parasol, handled it like a sacred weapon which a goddess, having acquitted herself honorably in the field of battle, sheds and placed it in the umbrella stand. Fear no more, said Clarissa, fear no more the heart of the sun, for the shock of Lady Bruton asking Richard to lunch without her made the moment in which she had stood shiver, as a plant on the river bed feels the shock of a passing oar and shivers. So she rocked, so she shivered. Millicent Bruton, whose lunch parties were said to be extraordinarily amusing, but not asked her. No vulgar jealousy could separate her from Richard, but she feared time itself and read on Lady Bruton's face as if it had been a dial cut in impassive stone, the dwindling of life. How year by year her share was sliced, how little the margin that remained was capable any longer of stretching, of absorbing, as if in the youthful years, the colors, salts, tones of existence, so that she filled the room she entered, and felt often as she stood hesitating one moment on the threshold of her drawing room, an exquisite suspense, such as might stay a diver before plunging while the sea darkness and the brightens beneath him, and the waves which threaten to break, but only gently split their surface, roll and conceal and encrust as they just turn over the weeds with pearl. She put the pad on the hall table. She began to go slowly upstairs with her hand on the banisters as if she had left a party where now this friend now that had flashed back her face, her voice, had shut the door and gone out and stood alone, a single figure against the appalling night, or rather, to be accurate, against the stare of this matter of fact June morning, soft with the glow of rose petal. For some, she knew and felt it as she paused by the open staircase window, which let in blinds flapping, dogs barking. Let in, she thought, feeling herself suddenly shriveled, aged, restless, the grinding, bowling, flowering of the day, out of doors, out of the window, out of her body and brain, which now failed, since Lady Bruton, whose lunch parties were said to be extraordinarily amusing, had not asked her. Only for a moment, but it was enough. It was a sudden revelation, a thing like a blush which one tried to check, and then, as it spread, one yielded to its expansion and rushed to the farthest verge, and then quivered and felt the world come closer, swollen with some astonishing significance, some pressure of rapture which split its thin skin and gushed and poured with an extraordinary elevation over the cracks and sores. Then, for that moment, she had seen an illumination, a match burning in a crocus, an inner meaning almost expressed. But the clothes withdrew, the heart softened. It was over, the moment. Against such moments with women too, then there contrasted as she laid her head down, red and barren marble, and the candle half burnt. Lying awake, the floor creaked, the lit house was suddenly darkened, and if she raised her head, she could just hear the click of the handle released as gently as possible by Richard, who slipped upstairs in his socks and then, as often as not, dropped his hot water bottle and swore. How she laughed! But this question of love, she thought, putting her coat away, this falling in love with women, take Sally Seton, her relation in the old days with Sally Seton. Had not that, after all, been love? She sat on the floor. That was her first impression of Sally. She sat on the floor with her arms around her knees, smoking a cigarette. Where could it have been? The Mannings, the Kinloch Jones, at some party where she could not be certain, for she had a distinct recollection of saying to the man she was with, "Who is that?" And he had told her and said that Sally's parents did not get on. How that shocked her that one's parents should quarrel. But all that evening she could not take her eyes off Sally. It was an extraordinary beauty of the kind she most admired, dark, large-eyed, with that quality which, since she hadn't got it herself, she always envied, a sort of abandonment, as if she could say anything, do anything, a quality much commoner in foreigners than in English women. Sally always said she had French blood in her veins. An ancestor had been with Mary Antoinette, had his head cut off, let a ruby ring. Perhaps that summer she came to stay at Burton, walking in quite unexpectedly without a penny in her pocket, one night after dinner, and upsetting poor Aunt Helena to such an extent that she never forgave her. There had been some quarrel at home. She literally hadn't a penny that night. When she came to them, she had pawned a brooch to come down. She had rushed off in a passion. They sat up till all hours of the night talking. Sally it was who made her feel, for the first time, how sheltered the life at Barton was. She knew nothing about social problems. She had once seen an old man who had dropped dead in a field. She had seen cows just after their calves were born. But Aunt Helena never liked discussion of anything, and Sally gave her William Morris. It had to be wrapped in a brown paper. There they sat after hour after there they sat hour after hour, talking with her bed, talking with her bedroom at the top of the house, talking about life, how they were to reform the world, how they were to reform the world. He meant to found a society to abolish private property and actually had a letter written. Though not sent out, the ideas were Sally's, of course, but very soon she was just as excited. Read Plato in bed before breakfast, read Morris, read Shelley by the hour. Sally's power was amazing, her gift, her personality. There was her way with flowers, for instance. At bottom, they always had stiff little vases all the way down the table. Sally went out, picked hollyhock, dahlias, all sorts of flowers that had never been seen together, cut their heads off and made them swim on the top of the water in bubbles. The effect was extraordinary. Coming into dinner and in the sunset, of course Aunt Helena thought it wicked to treat flowers like that. It's wicked to treat flowers like that. Then she forgot her sponge and ran along the passage naked. The grim old housemaid, Ellen Atkins, went about grumbling. Suppose any of the gentlemen had seen. Indeed, she did shock people. She was untidy, Papa said.
It was like running one's face against a granite wall in the darkness. It was shocking, it was horrible. Not for herself. She felt only how Sally was being mauled, already maltreated. She felt his hostility, his jealousy, his determination to break into their companionship. All this she saw as one sees a landscape in a flash of lightning. And Sally? Never had she admired her so much, gallantly taking her way unvanquished. She laughed. She made old Joseph tell her the names of the stars, which she liked doing very seriously. She stood there, she listened, she heard the names of the stars. Oh, this horror, she said to herself, as if she had known all along that something would interrupt, would embitter her moment of happiness. And after all, how much she owed to him later. Always, when she thought of him, she thought of their quarrels for some reason, because she wanted his good opinion so much, perhaps. She owned him words, sentimental, civilized. They started up every day of her life as if he guarded her. A book was sentimental, an attitude of life sentimental. Sentimental, perhaps she was to be thinking of the past. What would he think? He wondered when he came back. Then she had grown older. Would he say that, or would she see him thinking when he came back that he had grown older? It was true. Since her illness, she had turned almost white. Laying her brooch on the table, she had a sudden spasm, as if, while she mused, the icy claws had had the chance to fix in her. She was not old yet. She had just broken into her 52nd year. Months and months of it were still untouched. June, July, August, each still remained almost whole, and as if to catch the falling drop, Clarissa, crossing to the dressing table, plunged into the very heart of the moment, transfixed it there, the moment of this June morning, on which was the pressure of all the other mornings, seeing the glass, the dressing table, and all the bottles afresh, collecting the whole of her at one point as she looked into the glass, seeing the delicate pink face of the woman who was that very night to give a party of Clarissa Dalloway of herself. How many million times she had seen her face, and always with the same imperceptible contraction. She pursed her lips when she looked in the glass. It was to give her face point. That was herself, pointed, dart like, definite. That was herself when some effort, some call on her to be herself, drew the parts together. She alone knew how different, how incompatible, and composed so for the world only into one center, one diamond, one woman who sat in her drawing room and made a meeting point, a radiancy, no doubt, lives in some dull lives, a refuge for the lonely to come to. Perhaps she had helped young people who were grateful to her, had tried to be the same always, never showing a sign of all the other sides of her, false jealousies, vanities, suspicions, like this of Lady Bruton not asking her to lunch, which she thought combing her hair finally, is utterly base. Now, where was her dress? Her evening dresses hung in the cupboard. Clarissa, plunging her hand into the softness, gently detached the green dress and carried it to the window. She had torn it. Someone had trod on the skirt. She had felt it give it an embassy party at the top among the folds. But artificial light, the green shone, but lost its color now in the sun. She would mend it. Her maids had too much to do. She would wear it tonight. She would take her silks, her scissors, her, what was it? Her thimble, of course, down into the drawing room, for she must also write and see that things generally were more or less in order.
Hi, welcome listeners to the 16th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, page number 43, Fingerprint Classics.
It was like running one's face against a granite wall in the darkness. It was shocking, it was horrible. Not for herself. She felt only how Sally was being mauled, already maltreated. She felt his hostility, his jealousy, his determination to break into their companionship. All this she saw as one sees a landscape in a flash of lightning. And Sally? Never had she admired her so much, gallantly taking her way unvanquished. She laughed. She made old Joseph tell her the names of the stars, which she liked doing very seriously. She stood there, she listened, she heard the names of the stars. Oh, this horror, she said to herself, as if she had known all along that something would interrupt, would embitter her moment of happiness. Yet, after all, how much she owed to him later. Always, when she thought of him, she thought of their quarrels for some reason, because she wanted his good opinion so much, perhaps. She owned him words, sentimental, civilized. They started up every day of her life as if he guarded her. A book was sentimental, an attitude of life sentimental. Sentimental, perhaps she was to be thinking of the past. What would he think? He wondered when he came back. Then she had grown older. Would he say that, or would she see him thinking when he came back that he had grown older? It was true. Since her illness, she had turned almost white. Laying her brooch on the table, she had a sudden spasm, as if, while she mused, the icy claws had had the chance to fix in her. She was not old yet. She had just broken into her 52nd year. Months and months of it were still untouched. June, July, August, each still remained almost whole, and as if to catch the falling drop, Clarissa, crossing to the dressing table, plunged into the very heart of the moment, transfixed it there, the moment of this June morning, on which was the pressure of all the other mornings, seeing the glass, the dressing table, and all the bottles afresh, collecting the whole of her at one point as she looked into the glass, seeing the delicate pink face of the woman who was that very night to give a party of Clarissa Dalloway, of herself. How many million times she had seen her face, and always with the same imperceptible contraction. She pursed her lips when she looked in the glass. It was to give her face point. That was herself, pointed, dart like, definite. That was herself when some effort, some call on her to be herself, drew the parts together. She alone knew how different, how incompatible, and composed so for the world only into one center, one diamond, one woman who sat in her drawing room and made a meeting point, a radiancy, no doubt, some lives in some dull lives, a refuge for the lonely to come to. Perhaps she had helped young people who were grateful to her, had tried to be the same always, never showing a sign of all the other sides of her false jealousies, vanities, suspicions, like this of Lady Bruton, not asking her to lunch. which she thought combing her hair finally, is utterly base. Now, where was her dress? Her evening dresses hung in the cupboard. Clarissa, plunging her hand into the softness, gently detached the green dress and carried it to the window. She had torn it. Someone had trod on the skirt. She had felt it give it at embassy party at the top among the folds. But artificial light, the green shone, but lost its color now in the sun. She would mend it. Her maids had too much to do. She would wear it tonight. She would take her silks, her scissors, her, what was it? Her thimble, of course, down into the drawing room, for she must also write and see that things generally were more or less in order.
Hi, welcome listeners to the 17th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, page number 45, Fingerprint Classics. Strange, she thought, pausing on the landing and assembling that diamond shape, that single person. Strange how a mistress knows the very moment, the very temper of her house. Faint sounds rose in spirals up the well of the stairs. The swish of a mop, tapping, knocking, a loudness when the front door opened, a voice repeating a message in the basement, the chink of silver on a tray, clean silver for the party. All was for the party, and Lucy, coming into the drawing room with her tray held out, put the giant candlesticks on the mantelpiece, the silver casket in the middle, turned the crystal dolphin towards the clock. They would come, they would stand, they would talk in the mincing tones which she could imitate. Ladies and gentlemen, of all her mistress was loveliest, mistress of silver, of linen, of china. For the sun, the silver, doors off their hinges, Rumpelmayer's men gave her a sense as she laid the paper knife on the inlaid table of something achieved. Behold, behold, she said, speaking to her old friends in the baker's shop, where she had first seen service at Caterham. Prying into the glass, she was Lady Angela, attending Princess Mary, when in came Mrs. Dalloway. Oh, Lucy, she said, the silver does look nice. And how, she said, turning the crystal dolphin to stand straight. How did you enjoy the play last night? Oh, they had to go before the end, she said. They had to be back at 10, she said. So they don't know what happened, she said. That does seem hard luck, she said, for her servants stayed later if they asked her. That does seem rather a shame, she said, taking the old bald looking cushion in the middle of the sofa and putting it in Lucy's arms and giving her a little push and crying, take it away. Give it to Mrs. Walker with my compliments. Take it away, she cried. And Lucy stopped at the drawing room door, holding the cushion, and said, very shyly, turning a little pink, couldn't she help to mend the dress? But, said Mrs. Dalloway, she had enough on her hands already, quite enough of her own to do without that. But thank you, Lucy. Oh, thank you, said Mrs. Dalloway. And thank you, she went on saying, sitting down on the sofa with her dress over her knees, her scissors, her silks. Thank you, she went on saying in gratitude to her servants, gently for helping her to be like this, to be what she wanted, gentle, generous hearted. Her servants liked her. And then this dress of hers, where was the tear? And now her needle to be threaded. This was a favorite dress, one of Sally Parker's, the last almost she ever made.
Alas, for Sally had now retired, living at Ealing, and if ever I have a moment, thought Clarissa. But never would she have a moment any more. I shall go and see her at Ealing. For she was a character, thought Clarissa, a real artist. She thought of little out of the way things, yet her dresses were never cure. You could wear them at Hatfield. You could wear them at Hatfield, at Buckingham Palace. She had owned them at Hatfield, Buckingham Palace. Quite decent on her, quite descended on her, calm, content, as her needle drawing the silk smoothly to its gentle paws, collected the green folds together and attached them very lightly to the belt. So on a summer's day, waves overbalance, and fall, collect and fall. The whole world seems to be saying that is all, more and more ponderously, until even the heart in the body which lies in the sun on the beach says too, that is all. Fear no more, says the heart. Fear no more, says the heart, committing its burden to some sea which sighs collectively for all sorrows and renews, begins, collects, lets fall, and the body alone listens to the passing bee, the wave breaking, the dog barking, far away, barking and barking. Heavens, the front door bell, exclaimed Clarissa, staying her needle. Roused, she listened. Mrs. Dalloway will see me, said the elderly man in the hall. Oh, yes, she will see me, he repeated, putting Lucy aside very benevolently and running upstairs ever so quickly. Yes, 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 he muttered as he ran upstairs. She will see me. After 5 years in India, Clarissa will see me.
Hi, welcome listeners to the 18th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, page number 47, Fingerprint Classics. Who can, what can? Asked Mrs. Dalloway, thinking it was outrageous to be interrupted at 11 o'clock on the morning of the day she was giving a party. Hearing a step on the stairs, she heard a hand upon the door. She made to hide her dress like a virgin protecting chastity, respecting privacy, and now the brass knob slipped. Now the door opened, and it came for a single second she could not remember what he was called. So surprised she was to see him, so glad, so shy, so utterly taken aback to have Peter Walsh come to her unexpectedly in the morning. She had not read his letter. And how are you? Said Peter Walsh, positively trembling, kissing both her hands. She's grown older, he thought, sitting down. I shan't tell her anything about it, he thought, for she's grown older. He's looking at me, he thought, a sudden embarrassment coming over him. Though he had kissed her hands, putting his hand into his pocket, he took out a large pocket knife and half opened blade. Exactly the same, thought Clarissa. The same queer look, the same check suit, a little out of the straight his face is, a little thinner, drier perhaps, but he looks awfully well and just the same. How heavenly it is to see you again, she exclaimed. He had his knife out, that's so like him, she thought. He had only reached town last night, he said. Would have to go down into the country at once. And how was everything? How was everybody? Richard, Elizabeth. And what's all this? He said, tilting his penknife towards her green dress. He's very well dressed, not Clarissa, yet he always criticizes me. Here she is mending her dress as usual, he thought. Here she's been sitting all the time, have been in India, mending her dress, playing about, going to parties, running to the house and back, all that, he thought, growing more and more irritated, more and more agitated. For there's nothing in the world so bad for some women as marriage, he thought, and politics. And having a conservative husband like the admirable Richard, so it is, he thought. shutting his knife with a snap. Richard's very well. Richard's at a committee, said Clarissa. And she opened her scissors and said, did he mind her just finishing what she was doing to her dress? For they had a party that night, which I shan't ask you to, she said. My dear Peter, she said. But it was delicious to hear her say that. My dear Peter. Indeed, it was also delicious. The silver, the chairs, also delicious. Why wouldn't she ask him to her party? He asked. Now, of course, thought Clarissa, he's enchanting, perfectly enchanting. Now I remember how impossible it was ever to make up my mind. And why did I make up my mind not to marry him? She wondered. That awful summer. But it's so extraordinarily but it's so extraordinary that you should have come this morning, she cried, putting her hands one on top of another down on her dress. Do you remember, she said, how the blinds used to flap at Burton? They did, he said, and he remembered breakfasting alone very awkwardly with her father, who had died, and he had not written to Clarissa. But he had never got on well with old Barry, that querulous, weak-kneed old man, Clarissa's father, Justin Parry. I often wish I had got on better, your father, he said. But he never liked anyone who are friends, said Clarissa, and could have bitten her tongue for thus reminding Peter that he had wanted to marry her. Of course I did, thought Peter. It almost broke my heart too, he thought, and was overcome with his own grief, which rose like a moon, looked from the terrace, ghastly beautiful with the light from the sudden day. I was more unhappy than I have ever been since, he thought, and as if in truth he were sitting there on the terrace, he edged a little towards Clarissa, put his hand out, raised it, let it fall. There above them it hung, that moon. She thought she too seemed to be sitting with him on the terrace in the moonlight. Herbert has it now, she said. I never go there now, she said. Then, just as happens on a terrace in the moonlight, when one person begins to feel ashamed that he is already bored, and yet as the other sits silent, very quiet, sadly looking at the moon, does not like to speak, moves his feet, clears his throat, notices some iron scrawl on a table leg, stirs a leaf, but says nothing. So Peter Walsh did now. For why go back like this to the past? He thought. Why make him think of it again? Why make him suffer when she had tortured him so infernally? Why? Do you remember the lake? She said in an abrupt voice, under the pressure of an emotion which caught her heart, made the muscles of her throat stiff, and contracted her lips in a spasm as she said lake. For she was a child throwing bread to the ducks between her parents, and at the same time a grown woman coming to her parents who stood by the lake, holding her life in her arms, which she neared them grew larger and larger in her arms until it became a whole life, a complete life, which she put down by them and said, this is what I have made of it, this. And what had she made of it? What indeed? Sitting there sewing this morning with Peter. She looked at Peter Walsh, her look, passing through all that time, and that emotion reached him doubtfully, settled on him tearfully, and rose and fluttered away, as a bird touches a branch and rises, flutters away. Quite simply, she wimped her eyes. Yes, said Peter. Yes, 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 he said, as if she drew up on the surface something which positively hurt him as it rose. Stop, stop, she wanted to cry. He wanted to cry, for he was not old, his life was not over. Not by any means, he was only just past 50. Shall I tell her, he thought, or not? He would like to make a clean breast of it all, but she is too cold, he thought, sewing with her scissors. Daisy would look ordinary beside Clarissa, and she would think me a failure, which I am in their sense, he thought. In the Dalloways' sense, oh yes, he had no doubt about that. He was a failure compared with all this. The inland table, the mounted paper knife, the dolphin and the candlesticks, the chair covers, and old valuable English tinted prints. He was a failure. I detest the smugness of the whole affair, he thought. Richard's doing, not Clarissa's, save that she married him. Here Lucy came into the room, carrying silver, more silver, but charming, slender, graceful she looked. He thought as she stooped to put it down. And this has been going on all the time, he thought, week after week, Clarissa's life, while he thought, and at once everything seemed to radiate from him. Journeys, rides, quarrels, adventures, bridge parties, love affairs, work, work, work. And he took out his knife quite openly, his old horn handled knife, which Clarissa could swear he had had these 30 years, and clenched his fist upon it. What an extraordinary habit that was, Clarissa thought, always playing with a knife, always making one feel too frivolous, empty minded, a mere silly chatterbox, as he used. But I too, she thought, and walking and taking up her needle, summoned like a queen whose guards have fallen asleep and left her unprotected. She had been quite taken aback by this visit. It had upset her so that anyone can stroll in and have a look at her where she lies with the brambles covering over her, summoned to her help. The things she did, the things she liked, her husband, Elizabeth, herself, in short, which Peter hardly knew now, all to come about her and beat off the enemy. Well, what's happened to you? She said. So before a battle begins, the horses paw the ground, toss their heads, the light shines on their flanks, their necks curve. So Peter Walsh and Clarissa, sitting side by side on the blue sofa, challenged each other. His powers chaffed and tossed in him. He assembled from different quarters all sorts of things. Praise, his career at Oxford, his marriage, which he knew nothing whatever about, how he had loved and altogether done his job.
Hi, welcome listeners to the 19th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Page number 52, Fingerprint Classics. Millions of things, he exclaimed, and urged by the assembly of powers which were now charging this way and that, and giving him the feeling at once frightening and extremely exhilarating of being rushed through the air on the shoulders of people he could no longer see. He raised his hands to his forehead. Teresa sat very upright, drew in her breath. I'm in love, he said, not to her, however, but to someone raised up in the dark, so that you could not touch her, but must lay your garland down on the grass in the dark. In love? He repeated, now speaking rather dryly to Clarissa Dalloway. In love with a girl in India. In love with a girl in India. He had deposited his garland. Clarissa could make what she would of it. In love, she said, that he at his age should be sucked under in his little bow tie by that monster, and that's no flesh on his neck, and there's no flesh on his neck.
His hands are red, and he is 6 months older than I am. Her eye flashed back to her, but in her heart she felt all the same he is in love. He has that, she felt, he is in love. But the indomitable egotism which forever writes down the hosts opposed to him, the river which say no, which says on, even though it admits there may be no goal for us, whatever, still on. The indomitable egotism charged her cheeks with color, made her look very young, very pink, very bright eyed, as she sat with her dress upon her knee and her needle held to the end of the green silk. Trembling a little, he was in love. Not with her, with some younger woman, of course. And who is she? She asked. Now the state statue must be their height, brought from its height, and set down between them. A married woman, unfortunately, he said, the wife of a major in the Indian army. And with a curious, ironical sweetness, he smiled as he placed her in this ridiculous way before Clarissa. All the same, he is in love, thought Clarissa. She has, he continued, very reasonably, two small children, a boy and a girl. I have come over to see my lawyers about the divorce, there they are, he thought. Do what you like with them, Clarissa. There they are. And second by second, it seems to him that the wife of the major in the Indian army, his Daisy, and her two small children became more and more lovely as Clarissa looked at them, as if he had set light to a grey pellet on a plate and there had risen up a lovely tree in the brisk sea salted air of their intimacy. For in some ways no one understood him, felt with him as Clarissa did. Their exquisite intimacy. She flattered him, she fooled him, thought Clarissa, shaping the woman, the wife of the major in the Indian army, with three strokes of a knife. What a waste, what a folly. All his life long Peter had been fooled like that, first getting sent down from Oxford, next marrying the girl on the boat, going out to India, now the wife of a major in the Indian army. Thank heaven she had refused to marry him. Still he was in love. Her old friend, her dear Peter, he was in love. But what are you going to do? She asked him. Oh, the lawyers and the solicitors, Messrs. Hoopers and Greatly of Lincoln's Inn. They were going to do it, he said, and he actually pared his nails with his pocket knife. For heaven's sake, leave your knife alone, she cried to herself in irrepressible irritation. It was a silly unconventionality, his weakness, his lack of the ghost of a notion what anyone else was feeling that annoyed her, had always annoyed her, and now at his age, how silly. I know all that, Peter thought. I know what I'm up against, he thought, running his finger along the blade of his knife. Clarissa and Dalloway and all the rest of them. But I'll show Clarissa, and then, to his utter surprise, suddenly thrown by those uncontrollable forces, thrown through the air, he burst into tears, wept without without the least shame, sitting on the sofa, the tears running down his cheeks. Hi, welcome listeners to the 20th episode of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I know all that, Peter thought. I know what I'm up against, he thought, running his fingers along the blade of his knife, Clarissa and Dalloway, and all the rest of them. But I'll show Clarissa, and then to his utter surprise, suddenly thrown by those uncontrollable forces, thrown through the air, he burst into tears, wept without the least shame, sitting on the sofa, the tears running down his cheeks, and Clarissa had leant forward, taken his hand, drawn him to her, kissed him, actually had felt his face on hers before she could down the brandishing of silver flashing plumes like pampas grass in a tropic gale in her breast, which subsiding left her holding his hand, patting his knee, and feeling as she sat back extraordinarily at her ease with him and light-hearted, all in a clap. It came over her. If I had married him, this Gaiety would have been mine all day. It was all over for her. The sheet was stretched and the bed narrow. She had gone up into the tower alone and left them blackberrying in the sun. The door had shut, and there, among the dust of the fallen plaster and the litter of birds' nest, how distant the view had looked, and the sounds came thin and chill. Once on Leith Hill, she remembered, and Richard, she cried, as a sleeper in the night starts and stretches a hand in the dark for help. Lunching with Lady Bruton, it came back to her. He has left me. I am alone forever, she thought, folding her hands upon her knee. Peter Walsh had got up and crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, flicking a bandana handkerchief from side to side. Masterly and dry and desolate he looked, his thin shoulder blades lifting his coat slightly, blowing his nose violently. Take me with you, Clarissa thought impulsively, as if he were starting directly upon some great voyage, and then next moment it was as if the 5 acts of a play that had been very exciting and moving were now over, and she had lived a lifetime in them and had run away, had lived with Peter, and it was now over. Now it was time to move, and as the woman gathers her things together, her cloak, her gloves, her opera glasses, and gets up to go out of the theatre into the street. She rose from the sofa and went to Peter, and it was awfully strange, he thought, how she still had the power, as she came tinkling, rustling, still had the power, as she came across the room to make the moon, which the detested rise at Burton on the terrace in the summer sky. Tell me, he said, seizing her by the shoulders. Are you happy, Clarissa? Does Richard? The door opened. Here is my Elizabeth, said Clarissa, emotionally, histrionically, perhaps. How do you do? Said Elizabeth, coming forward. The sound of Big Ben striking the half hour struck out between them with extraordinary vigor, as if a young man, strong, indifferent, inconsiderate, were swinging dumbbells this way and that. Hello, Elizabeth, cried Peter, stuffing his handkerchief into his pocket, going quickly to her, saying goodbye, Clarissa, without looking at her, leaving the room quickly, and running downstairs and opening the hall door. Peter, Peter, cried Clarissa, following him out onto the landing. My party tonight, remember my party tonight, she cried, having to raise her voice against the roar of the open air, and overwhelmed by the traffic and the sound of all the clocks striking, her voice crying, remember my party night, sounded frail and thin and very far away as Peter Walsh shut the door.